afternoon. I'm Dr. Trevor Steinbach. I portray Dr. James Riley Monroe Gaskill from 45th Illinois, and I'm here to talk about medical innovations of the Civil War. Now, medicine during this time period is making a great transition, and it is transitioning from medieval medicine to modern medicine. So doctors during this time period are making that transition with their patients. We're going to look today at 9 different areas. Materia medica, how are they using drugs? Surgical issues, diagnostic, patient, emergency treatment, personnel, facilities, transportation, and medical research. All of these were innovative things that happened during the Civil War that had an impact on the Civil War soldier and how that person was treated. So let's go to our first topic, and that is materia medica, or drugs. And during this time period, again, we're making that transition from medieval medicine to modern medicine. So we are now not giving medicines to actually cause more of the symptoms of a disease to get rid of the disease. We're starting to use drugs to reduce the implications of a disease and cure the symptoms. Prior to this, one of the major things that we did was, unfortunately, evacuate the person's bowels to make them feel better. And what we were finding is that that was not very effective. Actually, it was causing more soldiers to probably die during this time period, giving them calomel, which had mercury in it. And of course, mercury is a heavy metal and a poison. Whereas we're now starting to give specific drugs and find specific drugs that actually cure different diseases. So it's a major change in how we prescribe medicine during the Civil War. Drugs to reduce and cure symptoms, not drugs to increase the symptom the person already has to cure them. Now, natural drugs were one of those things that was used highly during the Civil War. In fact, by 1864, about 80% of the drugs that were used on Civil War soldiers were botanicals, made from natural plants and herbs. This was especially effective in the South. And of course, you see in front of you Dr. Porcher. Dr. Porcher wrote the #1 book in the South in 1864 called Southern Fields and Forests. And in that book, he gave recommendations of all kinds of drugs that could be substitutes because the South could not get drugs through the Northern blockade. So they looked for natural drugs. We had women growing poppies for opium. We were trying all kinds of different drugs to see if we could cure malaria. Unfortunately, none of them worked very, very effectively. But we were giving lots of different botanicals during this time period. Natural drugs to cure symptoms was a major focus of the doctors during the Civil War. We were also starting to do something else during this time period, and that is the mass use of preventative drugs. Now you see here cinchona bark. Cinchona bark comes from Peru, and you see next to it quinine. By grinding up the bark, we created from that bark, a distillation, quinine. And quinine, of course, reduces the fever and makes it so that someone who has malaria possibly be either cured or reduce the symptoms so that they can survive. Now, we were using this as a mass prophylactic. In other words, we were giving it as a preventative. Soldiers didn't like the taste of quinine. It's extremely bitter. If you go to a grocery store today and buy quinine water, it still has a little bit of a bitter taste to it. You can actually go to Brazil today and you can find quinine in different soft drinks, sugared soft drinks, again, to hide that bitterness. So it was given to soldiers with a shot of whiskey. And of course, they'd always take their medicine with a shot of whiskey. One of the reasons why General Grant actually won at Vicksburg was because he was giving quinine to his troops and preventing them from having malaria. Now, of course, they had no idea it came from mosquitoes, and as far as a transmission system. So they thought it came from bad air, malaria, bad air. One of the other things that we see during this time period is the use of anesthetics. So that's another one of the drugs that we're doing with, and we're either using ether or chloroform or a combination of the two together. Now this is the third war that we're using anesthetics. The first war that we used some anesthetics in was the Mexican War. The second major war was the Crimean War, and we're now in the third war, the American Civil War. That means we're very, very effective with this. And we're so effective that less than 40 people were over-anesthetized with either chloroform or ether and died on the operating table. And that's out of 80,000 operations. So anesthetics is another area that we're looking at for the use, only we're now using it broadly across both the North and the South. Let's go back just for a second to that blockade. Well, the South had a problem trying to get anesthetics, but they solved that problem by every time they won a battle, they would release the doctors, but keep all of their drugs, and especially keep their chloroform. Now, we had some surgical innovations during the Civil War. And when we look at the different kinds of surgeries that we have, one of them is very, very surprising. We had plastic surgery. Dr. Gurdon Buck in New York at Belleville Hospital, one of the oldest hospitals in New York City, was actually doing facial reconstruction during the Civil War. Now, we think about facial reconstruction as a primary thing for World War I. There are lots of problems with wounds that caused from shrapnel that actually injure lots of soldiers during that war. We don't have quite as many, but we do have either from the misuse of drugs, as in the case of the gentleman that you actually see on the screen, where his face was rebuilt from too much calomel, or we have facial wounds where we're attempting to hide some of the problems that happen. And so plastic surgery is a brand new area that we're actually using during the Civil War. Another area that we have is jaw or dental reconstruction. And Dr. James Baxter Bean, this is a Southern doctor, CSA, used vulcanized Indian rubber to make splints to actually put broken jaws back together and use them to hold the teeth in place, because they didn't do wiring of jaws during that time period, but they could use these different components to actually hold the mouth together. You actually see an example on the right side here. This is one of the pieces that he used on a patient. And another word that you'd use for vulcanized rubber, of course, is gutta percha. And gutta percha we find in the United States in the 1920s. It's a pre-plastic, and they're actually using it to make radios out of. Interesting factoid. During the Civil War, the southern states had a dental corps, whereas the United States, or the Union Army, did not have a dental corps until 1911, right before the First World War. Doctors, during that time period, were issued 7 instruments and a 15-page brochure, and they pulled teeth, basically, out in the field. We also have, during this time period, amputation techniques. And surgeons are using basically 2 different kinds of techniques. One was to leave the wound open and clean it regularly until new skin was formed. And what they would do is take the arm and basically do a circular cut around there and remove the bad section. The other thing they could do is they could do 2 cuts so that the area was open, and cut off the bone and put those 2 pieces back together in a flap system. So there was some consistency between the types of amputation techniques that you're actually seeing during this war. Part of that reason is that you have a lot of your doctors learning surgical techniques right on the line, watching someone else, and then doing that technique themselves. We think about chest wounds during a war. And most of the time, if you had a chest wound, that lung would usually collapse. Well, Dr. Benjamin Douglas Howard was the first person to actually close chest wounds. And sometimes the lung reinflated, and sometimes it didn't. He did seal the chest, and it did reduce the number of deaths from chest wounds, especially if one had a good lung and then a partially usable lung on the other side from a wound. What he did was he took a piece of linen, put it over the wound area, and covered it with collodion. Now, collodion is very sticky. It comes from a tree sap, and what it looks like is clear Karo syrup. Now, it's also interesting that collodion was used to seal other things during this time period. If you had your picture taken, a tin type, they would seal that picture so that the picture would not be scratched again with collodion. This is about 1863 during the war that this is happening. We also see that surgery is starting to be done by competence. Now, usually at the beginning of the war, most of your doctors were majors, captains, and lieutenants. And of course, if you were the major, you were the person who could do the most of the surgery as you were the highest rank. That didn't mean you were the most competent. It depended on the medical school you went to and whether you took that extra anatomy course and knew what to do and had had any surgery in your medical background. What we find is that the start of the war, they're doing it by rank. By the end of the war, they're doing it by competence. So we could actually see a lieutenant who was a surgeon, who was extremely competent, doing most of the surgery for a division or a corps, along with a number of other surgeons, and a person who was a major basically bandaging and doing triage with the rest of the patients because his surgical technique was not as good. So surgery by competence was one of those other areas. Let's turn to our second area, and that is diagnostic innovations. We are now diagnosing different kinds of diseases. The first one is we are now starting to work on heart patients. Yes, during the Civil War. Dr. DaCosta has a syndrome named after him, which was colloquially known as soldier's heart. Now, today, we could use that term, which we see in the literature, PTSD. His research was actually at Turner Lane Hospital in Philadelphia, and he was sent there specifically because of his background and his research. And they sent specific patients to him there at Turner Lane. He observed those patients. He gave them good food, a clean bed, mild exercise. And some of them who came in with heart palpitations actually left feeling pretty good. Many of them went back to their units. Some of them were discharged. But he has the first ward that is focusing on heart and heart treatments. In the same hospital, we have Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell at Turner Lane Hospital using electricity to treat nerve damage and try to get nerves to reconnect so that the muscles would work and so that people could use their arms and their legs after damage from mini balls or other kinds of wounds during the Civil War. And the little box that you see there, you actually turn the crank and it generates electricity. It's much like the windmill that you see on the side of the road today that's generating electricity. It was at 0.5 amps, so it was a very low amperage, but it would light today an 80-watt light bulb. So you can imagine a doctor giving a treatment to a patient, sitting there and turning that crank for 15 or 20 minutes at a specific speed so that it generated enough electricity to stimulate the muscles. We also have, during this time period, the development of veterinary medicine. And we don't usually think about veterinary medicine as an area with the Civil War, but vet colleges actually existed. They were hiring veterinary staff. They actually developed horse infirmaries. The gentleman you see here is a veterinary surgeon from a Pennsylvania cavalry unit. There was a veterinary surgeon in Illinois with the 8th Illinois, and they are trying to treat horses for a disease that is killing a lot of them called glanders. Part of the problem they had was they would put large herds of horses together to be able to feed them and then to be able to distribute them. Well, the disease went through those herds, killing some of those horses, and so they started to spread out the areas that they were having the horses in, much like we're doing today with COVID-19. President Lincoln talked about horses one time. One of his generals was captured along with 50 horses. And his statement was, "I can make generals, but I can't make horses." Horses were very important during the Civil War. Now, there were a lot of patient innovations during the Civil War. We talk about mass vaccinations. We are mass vaccinating entire regiments of 1,000 men. The problem that we had was that many of the men who went into these regiments during the Civil War, especially here in Wisconsin, Illinois, the Midwest, lived on farms. They had no natural immunities to many of the childhood diseases. The one we could do is smallpox. And actually, if you vaccinated a regiment, roughly 33%, or about a little over 300 of the men, would have come down with that disease. The rest of them would have had the antibodies and maybe been mildly sick or not sick at all. Hopefully, enough of those recovered that you would keep your strength within your regiment. One of the reasons, again, the South lost at Vicksburg was because there was a smallpox outbreak, and it took many of the soldiers that were inside Vicksburg on the Confederate side to sick cold. We also saw during this time period improved prosthetics. Now, you'll notice that it says the E.J. Hanger Company for artificial limbs. Mr. Hanger, in 1861, had his leg shot off by a cannonball in West Virginia. Now, he was an engineer. Approximately 3 months after he lost his leg, he experimented and designed an artificial limb. He went later to develop his company, and the J.E. Hanger Company itself still does exist in a different form today, providing prosthesis for U.S. military coming out of Iraq or Afghanistan. It's interesting that the Union government would pay a soldier $50 towards his prosthetic. That doesn't sound like a lot of money, but in dollars today, in 2020, that would have been a $2,000 prosthetic. So it's one of those things that was necessary after the war and during the war. And they were significantly improved as one of those areas that comes out of innovations during the Civil War. We also have the hypodermic needle. Hypodermic needles are used to inject liquids, like morphine. Now, this is not something that a regular surgeon in the North would have had out in the field unless they bought their own. And literally you did. You bought your own if you wanted one. They had a gold-plated needle on them. They were very, very rugged, and you used that to inject into the skin, especially if you had an amputation, to reduce the pain area in that area, or if the person had some other wound. The problem is we didn't know anything about germs. Germs aren't technically invented until 1866, when we see Dr. Lister, who is publishing his information. And so you would use this, rinse it off, use it on the next person, rinse it off, use it on the next person. When the needle broke eventually, then you buy a new needle. So it was an innovation, but because we didn't know much about medicine from the point of view of germs, it did spread things between different patients also. Now, emergency treatment is another innovation area. This is the first war where we're dealing with aid stations, field hospitals, general hospitals. We are setting up aid stations, usually with a first assistant surgeon and another gentleman with that person with a bandaging kit, and that would be somewhere between 50 and 100 feet in a low area away from where the firing line was actually at. So the first person to treat a patient would have been at an aid station. If the patient needed to go to another level, they would end up at a field hospital, which is usually a mile, 2 miles, sometimes up to 5 miles away. They could be transported in different methods, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And if they needed to go somewhere else, they would go to a field hospital, from a field hospital to a general hospital. And of course, general hospitals were somewhere between 200 and 500 miles. So if you were somewhere in Georgia with Uncle Billy Sherman on the march to Atlanta, and you were a serious case, you may end up on the railroad going back to either Chattanooga or maybe all the way to Nashville. Patient triage was another area that we were working on during this time period. But our patient triage was very, very different than what we use today. You'll notice the color codes that are on this slide. Red is see immediately, amber is 10 minutes, yellow is sometime in the first hour, green is sometime in the next 2 hours, blue is even farther away as far as time period. Now, that's what paramedics do today. Anyone who gets a red tag put on them, those are transport as soon as you can. We are stabilizing the patient and getting them into an ambulance. During the Civil War, when patients came to us, especially at that first level, and that is at the aid station, the green patients were really treated first because they could go back out on the firing line and hopefully win the battle. The yellow patients, what we would see within 60 minutes today, the yellow patients were usually surgery patients, and they would end up at a field hospital or at some other larger hospital facility during this time period. At the red patients, we'd make them very comfortable. We'd probably give them a little bit of opium and alcohol in some tea or some water, 2, maybe 3 drops at the most. And we would make them write their last letter home, because most of the time, if we put them under a tree and made them comfortable, they would die sometime within the next 3 days. If they didn't, then we'd see what else we could do for that patient. How about personnel? Personnel during this time period is interesting because this is on-the-job training. They did amputations. They saw an amputation. You're a new doctor. You've been assigned to the 45th. I'm going to do an amputation. You're going to watch me do that amputation, maybe once, maybe twice. And then I'm going to hand you the knife, the saw, and you're going to perform one under my guidance. Within a week or two, you're going to be very good at doing this. Doctors during this time period went to school, but they only went from October to April. And you did 2 of those sessions, and usually summer spent with another doctor, so you had no real practical surgery experience. And most of your doctors returned to their small towns that they had come from in Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Indiana, and they had phenomenal surgical skills that they never learned in medical school, but learned right on the job with on-the-job training. For the ladies, nursing was one of those new areas that you were finally accepted in. You know, most women did nursing, but they did nursing on a family level. They weren't usually in any kind of hospital. They didn't usually work with non-family members. Especially in the South, that was not considered ladylike. Whereas we had over 18,000 Union women who had served during the Civil War that we have pension records on. And out of that, 2,448 actually received pensions for the distinction of what they did in serving the men. Some of them did it voluntarily. Some of them did it as cooks. Some of them did it as traditional nurses. Some of them were in charge of wards even in larger hospitals as a ward matron. So women are out there for the first time learning the job, again, like the surgeons were in hospitals. We also have nuns being used as nurses. There are over 640 Catholic religious sisters from 21 different religious groups that volunteered for both sides. The Sisters of Charity was one of the larger groups that was there. Doctors did like having nuns in their hospitals. They didn't take up a lot of space. They didn't request a lot of things, and they did what they were told. At least that's what some of the doctors said in Cairo, Illinois, that they preferred nuns to quote-unquote society ladies. African-American doctors are used for the first time in the military. We had 3 commissioned doctors during the Civil War. Dr. Augusta, Dr. McCord, and Dr. DeGrassi. All 3 of them had commissions. In fact, Dr. Augusta was the first doctor during the Civil War who was a major, okay, as an African American, and upon his death had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and was the first African American doctor buried in Arlington Cemetery. Now, notice he had to get his medical degree in Toronto because he could not be accepted at a medical facility for a degree in the United States. Surgeons were in charge of contraband hospitals. Those hospitals were primarily for freed blacks and former slaves. We also had 9 other doctors who were African Americans who served during the Civil War as acting assistant surgeons. So they were appointed as an acting surgeon, but did not have permanent military positions. One of those, by the way, is Dr. Abbott, and you see a picture of Dr. Abbott here. And his distant relatives still live today in Chicago, Illinois. Civilians were involved in medicine during the Civil War. We had the Sanitary Commission. Now, the Sanitary Commission was a very interesting group because they raised $417.5 million for extras for the boys. They served, many of them, as nurses on the brown water Navy ships, which would have been up and down the Mississippi, hospital ships, on the green water Navy ships, which would have been in the estuaries, like Chesapeake Bay, and on the blue water Navy ships that were transporting wounded from the Peninsula Campaign all the way up to Boston and New York. And they also did one other primary area that most people don't know about, and that is they put out a series of documents from letter A through letter U that actually were training booklets with the most up-to-date medical information and provided those free to medical officers and surgeons during the Civil War to help keep them up to date on techniques. Facilities changed during the Civil War. We have what we call Pavilion Hospitals now. We actually had, on the Union side, 204 hospitals with a bed capacity of 136,000 beds during the Civil War. Satterley Hospital, which you'll see in the upper left corner of this set of pictures, had over 4,500 patients at one time. You see in Philadelphia, they had over 14,000 beds. The largest hospital on the Confederate side was Chimborazo, which was at Richmond, and it had over 7,000 beds, a brewery, a dairy, and they actually did their own farming of some of the vegetables. The picture that you see in the upper right, that is Judiciary Square, and that is one of the hospitals that was very close that President Lincoln and Mrs. Lincoln used to visit because it was walkable from the White House. The picture on the bottom there is Turner Lane Hospital in Philadelphia. Now, if you look at the Pavilion Hospital, which is Satterley in the upper left, you'll notice that it's a wagon wheel. And that was the idea behind these hospitals. Instead of putting everybody together, so if you had smallpox, if you had an amputation, if you had a high fever, we put you in the same ward. No, we started to take spokes of that wheel and isolate different kinds of patients to those different locations. So specific wards for gangrene, for smallpox, for typhoid, for stumps, heart wards, nerve damage, all of those were different things that we used during the Civil War. How about transporting our people? Well, we had stretchers for patients, we moved them. And at the beginning of the war, we used the band. So if your regiment had a band, they weren't playing necessarily during a battle. They were handed stretchers and they were hauled people off the field. And that's because if the person next to you actually gets hit by a bullet and goes down, and you take that person off the field, you've now lost 2 rifles. We wanted the people with the rifles to keep firing. We started to use the band, and it eventually went to stretcher bearers. We also had ambulances. Now, I don't think I would have really liked being in one of these ambulances. Ambulances have been around since the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. Dr. Leray actually had what he called flying ambulances. You'll see some ambulances here, but one where you can look in the end, you'll notice that you could sit 6 people in here, or you could take part of the bench, flip it up, and you could have 2 patients inside. We also now have specific people who drive ambulances, at least starting in 1864, because at the Battle of Bull Run, they hired people to pick up the wounded and the minute the battle started, they skedaddled or left the battlefield, leaving the wounded to their own ways to get to the hospitals. We had trains during this time period. We had specific cars that were made for trains. You can see on the left, looks like stretchers that are hanging there. Well, they're hanging from giant rubber bands so that they kind of bounce along as the train bounces along. Trains actually had red lanterns on them and red flags so they were not attacked and could notify the other side that this was a hospital train. And of course, we had hospital ships during this time period. The most famous is the one on the upper left, which is the Red Rover. It originally was sunk by the Union at the Battle of Island 10. It was raised. It had a 400-pound ice chest in it, and it went back and forth on the brown water of the Mississippi, bringing the wounded into Cairo, into Jefferson Barracks, which is St. Louis, and all the way up to Keokuk, Iowa, and Quincy. So inside of the ship, you would have seen wards just like this, which is what the bottom picture looks like. Now, what about research during this time period? Well, medical research actually makes some big jumps. Prior to this, you were really not required to go back to school and have different kinds of training. In fact, that really didn't come in until the 1880s, when states were actually starting to license doctors, and they had to have continuing ed. What we find is that the Sanitary Commission, and this one is a Rules of Preserving Health for the Soldier, which was printed in 1861, just one of the flyers that they put out. Many of these were about 5 to 10 pages. Were used to educate doctors in the field. Now, unlike the North, the South had its own medical and surgical journal. And that medical and surgical journal actually started in January of 1864 and ran until February of 1865. They did have a final edition, but unfortunately it burnt up when the North captured Richmond, and the fires were set by those who were leaving Richmond itself. This was the first war where we were actually collecting medical specimens. Now, if you look on the right, you see a building. The building is a closed theater. That theater is Ford's Theater. It was taken over by the U.S. government medical department after the Lincoln assassination, and Ford could no longer make a profit because people didn't want to go to his theater. I mean, the president had been assassinated there. So it was taken over and rehabbed, and they collected specimens in the field, and it also became the National Medical Library during the war and post-war. So this was a collection of different things. If there was an unusual amputation and the arm had been damaged in an unusual way, that arm was actually sent to Washington, D.C. as a specimen. There was a gentleman, the story is told, who, after his amputation, said he wanted his arm. He wanted to have the arm that he had lost. And the doctor looked at him like this and said, "How many years did you sign up for? 3, or the duration of the war?" "Well, you can't stay in the fight, but we own your arm until the end of your tour of duty. So you can come back and you can collect your arm when your arm has served its full time." Just one of those interesting stories that comes out medically. The United States had a newfound relationship with Europe and its medicine after the Civil War. The Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, which was a post-war book between 1870 and 1888, was written. It was written in 6 original volumes. Today the reprints are actually 15 volumes. But it detailed lots of research, lots of data that happened during the war. And it's case by case, and it's statistics, and it's information on different kinds of medical situations that the military had encountered. It was so detailed that it was accepted as the highest quality medical research by the Europeans. Now, most doctors during this time period, they go to medical school in the United States. Then they go to Europe, usually for 6 months, and study in either Paris or later in Vienna or later in Berlin to kind of round out and get the most up-to-date information medically. This was a very impressive volume, but it also is impressive for one other reason. It gives us so much detail today as researchers into medicine and what actually happened during the Civil War with the detail that it had. Now, one last thing I'd like to show you, and that is we think about diseases during the Civil War, and we think about today with COVID-19. Let's take a look at what actually happened. And I'm going to use the case of malaria. Seasonal diseases in the 1860s. Diseases were actually focused on different time periods. Doctors knew that in the spring you're going to have snake bites, smallpox, fevers, mumps, measles, tonsillitis. Most of the time in the summer, here were some of the diseases you had, including worms and dysentery and cholera and intermittent fever and remittent fever and continued fever. All of these fevers just kind of blurred. In the autumn, yeah, you'd have typhoid and TB and dysentery. And in the winter, pneumonia. People got colds. People got consumption, TB. People got whooping cough or croup or even scurvy because they weren't eating enough vegetables. During the Civil War, this gives you an idea of how diseases spread. If you look at 1861, 1862, the small area, okay, that's on the upper right-hand corner of the first picture, that's kind of checkered, is less than 25% of the troops had malaria. If you go to the area that's turquoise, that's somewhere between 25 and 50% of the troops had malaria. If you go to the yellow area, that's 50 to roughly 75%. And if you go to the red area, that's 75% or greater. Notice how malaria spreads during the Civil War. Now, part of this is because just the seasons. There's the seasons of what we call sickness, okay? When the mosquitoes are out and they're spreading the disease. But what we also see in here is, as the war continues, more and more northern troops get into areas where there are malaria-infested swamps and catch the disease itself. So the disease actually spreads. Let's look at it this way. Here's 1861-62. Here's 1862-63. Here's 1863-64. And here's 1864-65. The chances of you probably getting malaria were probably pretty great by the end of the war, depending on where you were located. But as you can see, the Mississippi Valley, the southern area of Alabama, the area in Virginia, areas in Virginia and North Carolina along the coast, you're seeing an awful lot of malaria. Disease did have a factor, but not until after the war did we have these kinds of statistics where we could actually start to track what was happening and see how contagion spread through different ways and affect the troops. That's why that history of the medical area of the Civil War was so important. Thank you. Do we have any questions from online? How do they know how much chloroform to use? Oh, well, okay. First off, chloroform is very safe. It has to be very safe. I mean, one of Queen Victoria's children was delivered and she used chloroform. So it must be okay the Queen used it. Usually what they do is they put 2, 3, 4 drops on some kind of a cloth. Now, if you can imagine a handkerchief, that's an easy way to do it. You'd make it into a kind of a cone, put it above the nose and the face, put 3, 4, 5 drops on it, and tell the person to breathe deeply. The advantage you had during the Civil War is you weren't hooked up to a whole lot of machines, so you were physically watching the patient. Once the patient went from level 1 to level 2 to level 3 of an anesthesia, level 3, they could do this. The patient looks like he's unconscious, okay? He's still breathing very well. They would take their finger and rub it across the eye like this. And if nothing moved, they knew the patient could not feel anything and the patient could not hear anything. And the patient was under, you could proceed. That took somewhere between about 10 and 12 minutes. If the patient started to come to consciousness, you put the rag back over their face. If the patient's breathing became very, very shallow, you take the rag farther off of the face. So they physically did this by watching the patient themselves. And that's how they figured out how much chloroform they were going to use.
I have one, Trevor.
Okay.
What, in your opinion, is the most lasting medical innovation to come out of the American Civil War?
What is the most lasting medical innovation of the Civil War? I think the ambulance system and hospital arrangements with the wards, because we still have wards today. We still isolate certain kind of patients. We have an ambulance system where we're getting them off the field. After Gettysburg, they got them off the field very, very, very quickly. But Bull Run took up to a week to get the last of the patients off the field. They had almost all their patients off within 2 days at Gettysburg. The speed that they could then give medical attention to those patients and hopefully have those patients survive, I think was very, very critical. So if I had to look at it, I would say an ambulance system and a system where you're isolating patients so that you're not spreading things between patients who do not have the same either disease or wound or problem. And those are probably the two biggest. We don't still know anything about germs. Germ theory is still at least another year off. And actually, Dr. Lister comes in 1876 to the Philadelphia Exposition in the United States and talks about antiseptic surgery and gets practically laughed off of the stage. It's not till the late 1870s, 1880s that we finally get rid of medical instruments that have wooden handles that you can't sterilize. Well, thank you. Glad you joined us today. If you have other questions, please contact me.